At my anniversary, my daughter introduced me as the babysitter. That was the sentence that tore through the air like glass shattering. I was standing in front of family, neighbors, and church friends who had gathered in the town hall decorated with white lights and faded roses. My name is Vera Lorne. I am 77 years old, once a schoolteacher in this very town. And in that moment I was turned into a stranger in my own story. The applause that followed wasn't for me. It was for Diane, my eldest daughter, a lawyer with a sharp smile and a voice trained to command any room. She stood at the podium, her manicured fingers resting on the microphone, calling me our faithful babysitter, with the same casual cruelty one might use to brush away dust. People laughed politely, unsure if it was a joke, and I felt the blood in my face burn hotter than the candles on the tables. Diane knew exactly what she was doing. She had rehearsed it. I realized when I saw the printed program on every table, beneath my name, in small italics. It read, Family Caregiver. This wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was a statement. I had spent 55 years with Tom, my late husband, building a life out of sweat and discipline, paying off the mortgage, brick by brick, never missing a bill. He has been gone for 7 years now, yet in the hall his absence felt heavier than ever. I looked at the framed photo of us on our wedding day, displayed near the cake, and even there my image was faint, almost hidden by the glare of the lights. Tom's smile was clear, commanding, but my face looked blurred, like I had already been erased. Richard, my oldest son, sat at one of the front tables, wearing the same worn jacket he always wore to family events. At 52 he looked older than he should, his failures weighing on him like stones. He clapped along when Diane finished her introduction, but his eyes slid away from mine quickly. He couldn't meet my gaze, and I wondered if he felt shame or relief. Emily, my youngest at 45, sat toward the back, shoulders hunched, her hands fidgeting with the napkin in her lap. She avoided looking at me altogether. For a moment, I wanted to believe she was embarrassed for me, but I couldn't read her expression. Diane had already pulled her too close, too often, and I feared Emily's loyalty was no longer her own. Michael, Diane's son, tall and confident at 30, leaned against the wall with his phone, barely paying attention to the celebration. When he heard babysitter, he smirked, the way young men do when they think cruelty is clever. My own grandson looked at me as though I were furniture in the room, not the reason the room even existed. As the night went on, guests came up to congratulate Diane on the lovely speech. Some even patted my shoulder as if I had indeed been a loyal servant. My hands shook as I poured coffee from the silver urn, the bitter smell rising like old regrets. I heard whispers, she still helps out, doesn't she? How lucky they are. They didn't say how lucky she is to have raised them, but how lucky they were to have me cleaning up their messes even in old age. The microphone was set aside after Diane's toast, but I could still see the red light glowing faintly on its stem. It called to me. I remembered every assembly at the school where I once worked, standing before rows of restless children, holding their attention not with power but with respect. My voice had once mattered. Tonight, it had been stolen. When I picked up the program, again, the words family caregiver glared up at me. It wasn't just a description, it was a rebranding. Diane had written me out of my own life, reducing 77 years of teaching, saving, raising, and protecting into the role of a hired hand. I thought of the house Tom and I built together, the cedar beams, the porch we hammered in the summer heat, the oak tree in the yard where we hung swings for the children. That house wasn't just wood and nails, it was the diary of our family written in grain and stone. It was the one thing I still believed was truly mine, and as I stood in that hall, hearing laughter bounce off the walls, I felt a deep chill that Diane's words weren't simply about belittling me. They were about replacing me. Pastor Samuel, the town's minister, offered a prayer before dinner. His words about honoring parents rang hollow under the glow of chandeliers. I saw Diane bow her head with practiced reverence, but I knew the prayer meant nothing to her. For her, faith was a stage, not a compass. I walked toward the display table where photos from across the years were laid out. There were pictures of birthdays, holidays, graduations. In one, Richard at 10 with his new baseball glove. In another, Emily at 12 in her choir robe. Diane had arranged these herself, carefully chosen images, but I noticed something chilling. In several of them, my presence was missing. Photos where I remembered standing with my children had been replaced with crops that framed them alone. It was as if the history of our family had been edited. My chest tightened. This was not negligence. This was design. The clinking of glasses called everyone back to attention as Diane announced dinner. Platters of roast beef and potatoes were carried out, the smell rich and heavy. People began to eat, but I could not swallow. The weight of the program, the photos, the whispers pressed on me. I thought of Tom's steady voice, the way he used to say, "You must never let anyone write your story for you, Vera." I stood from my chair. My knees ached, but I steadied myself against the table. All eyes weren't on me, they were still on Diane, glowing under the attention she loved so much. I reached for the microphone, the same one she had used to erase me. It was heavier than I remembered, or maybe my arms were weaker than I wanted to admit. But when I brought it to my lips, my voice carried, sharpened by years of discipline. "I was not your babysitter," I said, each word deliberate. The room stilled, forks froze in midair. I saw faces shift, some confused, some embarrassed, some alarmed. I was the woman who raised these children. I was the wife who built a home with Tom Lauren. I am not the shadow of this family. I am its root. The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was heavy, thick, pressing down on everyone present. Diane's smile faltered for the first time that evening. Her fingers tightened around her wine glass, and I saw in her eyes a flicker of anger, not the anger of being misunderstood, but the anger of being challenged. I set the microphone back down and returned to my seat. My heart thudded, but my hands were steady now. I had said what needed to be said. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, I felt my spine straighten. Still, beneath the firmness of my words, a question gnawed. Why would Diane orchestrate this? Why erase me in front of everyone who had known me all their lives? It wasn't just cruelty, it was strategy. And in that realization, a darker suspicion stirred in me that tonight's humiliation was only the first cut in a plan much larger than I could yet see. The celebration went on, but the air had changed. I watched Diane move through the crowd, her smile back in place, but sharper, brittle, at the edges. I watched Richard drink too quickly, his eyes darting away from mine. I watched Emily fold napkins over and over, her hands trembling, and I watched Michael lean in close to his mother, whispering with the smugness of someone who believed the future was already written. But I knew one thing, as I left that hall, the story of Vera Lorne would not be erased. Not tonight. Not ever. I woke up the morning after the celebration with the program still on my nightstand, the one that labeled me in small italics as family caregiver. The flowers on the cover had bled a little where a glass of water tipped in the night. I carried it to the kitchen and set it beside the coffee maker as if it were a bill I intended to pay. Sunlight pushed through the thin curtains and drew a line across the table where Tom and I had signed our mortgage papers decades ago. I am Vera Lorne, 77 years old, a former schoolteacher, a woman who knows the weight of signatures, and I could feel that little line of print trying to overwrite my name. I decided to check the one public place where names pretend to be permanent. At the public library, the computers hum whether anyone respects you or not. I walked in when the doors opened, nodding to the morning crowd. Behind the help desk sat a woman I knew by sight but not by name. She wore her gray hair in a neat braid, and had the posture of someone who believed in order. When I asked for a computer, she handed me a slip with a number and told me I had an hour. She introduced herself as Marla Reed, the library's genealogy volunteer, patient and precise, the kind of person who files history for a living. The login page bloomed into the family tree Diane had boasted about at Thanksgiving. The digital archive, she said, would keep our family's stories safe forever. I found the Lorne line and followed it like a path through woods I knew by heart. Tom's profile appeared, whole and clean. His parents, his brothers, dates of service, pictures, in uniform, all there. Then I looked for myself. My name wasn't attached to him. It wasn't attached to Richard. It wasn't attached to Diane or Emily. The branch where I should have been was empty, then filled with a name I hadn't thought of in years. A woman who once helped us after school when I took on late tutoring sessions. She had braided Emily's hair before choir practice and kept an eye on Diane during those restless middle school summers. Her name had been moved into the position labeled Mother. The screen didn't flicker. It didn't apologize. It simply presented a version of truth polished enough to pass for fact. My hand went cold on the mouse. I scrolled down to the changelog out of habit. The the way I used to check red marks after grading essays. There it was, updated last week by a curator with a name I knew better than my own. There was no mistake to argue with, only intention. I printed the page because paper has a way of making lies feel heavier, and weight is easier to fight than fog. The printer coughed out the family tree with its neat lines and boxes. In the top right corner, where a watermark identified the account owner, Diane's name sat like a stamp. I carried the sheet to Marla's desk and set it between us. She looked down, and in the pause before she spoke, I understood she saw everything: the altered field, the added photos, the empty space where I was supposed to be. She chose her words carefully, keeping them low and steady. She explained that the library's access was redundantly for public trees. She said edits could only be reversed by the account manager or through a formal request if the information violated documented records. Then she asked if I had marriage certificates or birth certificates that listed me as mother. Her question was not cruel. It was procedure clothed in courtesy. I told her I had papers in a safe deposit box and more in a cedar chest at home. I admitted I hadn't thought I would ever need them for this purpose. She offered to print instructions for filing a correction, and slid a pen across the desk so I could jot down the case number I would need. She also said, with a librarian's careful neutrality, that sometimes families use these sites to settle scores. They are too polite to speak aloud. This was the moment people like to call a teachable one, but I did not feel like teaching. I felt like pinning this page to a wall and drawing a red circle around the word mother until the ink bled through. Instead, I thanked Marla for her time. I told her I understood she could not change what she did not have authority to change. It mattered to say that to her face, to show that rules are not the enemy and that I recognized the difference between a person and a system. She looked relieved, and in that small relief I felt a thin line of human decency hold. Back at home, I spread the prints on the kitchen table beside the program that had started this descent. I pulled open the junk drawer and found a red marker. I didn't scribble rage across the sheet. I did something quieter. I drew a small root beneath the tree where my name should have been and wrote the date in my neat teacher's hand. Then I reached for my wedding ring, dipped its face in the shallow dish of leftover coffee, and pressed a circle over the empty space where a mother's name belonged. It left a faint brown halo, not permanent, but present. I set the paper upright against the sugar canister and let it dry as if it were a photograph. The mail arrived late morning. Among the catalogs and charity appeals sat an envelope from a credit union I did not use. The letter inside congratulated me on successfully changing my preferred contact phone number and email. They were not mine. The address listed belonged to Richard. I read it twice to be sure I wasn't misreading. The letter used my full name, thanked me for trusting them, and warned me to call immediately if the changes were not authorized. I folded it carefully and set it under the printed family tree. The weight grew. Richard has always had a gift for promising that tomorrow would be the new start, the clean ledger, the job that stuck. At 52, he wears fatigue like a second skin and hope like a borrowed coat. He is my son. He is also a man who has learned to live on extensions and favors. I texted him to stop by because there was leftover cake. The message included a picture of the chocolate frosting he used to scrape off as a boy when he preferred vanilla. He wrote back that he would come that afternoon. While I waited, I carried the cedar chest from the bedroom to the dining room. The hinges complained. Inside lay our marriage certificate, yellowed at the edges, and 3 birth certificates folded into creases that matched my memory of filing days. I set them in a row. The documents did not argue with me. They might not keep a living record honest, but they could anchor a claim when the time came. Richard arrived smelling like cold air and old coffee. He hugged me with a stiffness that had nothing to do with age. I told him there was cake. I watched him cut a piece that was more frosting than crumb. I showed him the credit union letter. He glanced at it the way he glances at parking tickets, as if it belonged to a future he could negotiate away. He said he would look into it, that it must be a mix-up, that he would call. He offered to take the mail going forward so I could rest. He said the house and everything in it was a lot to manage for me at my stage, and he could make it easier. I did not argue with words. I opened the cedar chest again and laid the marriage certificate beside the letter. I let him see my maiden name become Lorne, let him see the ink where Tom signed, the witness, the embossed seal. I simply observed that names change for reasons that matter. He nodded too quickly. He said he would fix the contact information by the weekend. He He took a second slice of cake and slipped the envelope back onto the stack as if it might disappear, if it touched enough paper. After he left, I noticed the small bowl on the entry table where I keep the spare mailbox key was empty. I searched the drawer and the dish by the sink. The key was gone. I replayed the way Richard had scooped up his gloves and hat. I imagined the key leaving the bowl with an ease born of habit. He would say it was to help, to save me steps. Help is a word that can mean many things depending on whose fingers close around it. In the afternoon, I drove to the bank to check my safe deposit box. The clerk at the window was new, a young man with a practiced politeness. He put on like a uniform. I presented my ID, signed the log, and watched as he retrieved the small metal container and escorted me to a booth. Inside the box were the documents I expected and the ones I had forgotten. The deed to the house with Tom's steady script undermined, a photocopy of his will designating me as the primary decision-maker, the receipts from the final mortgage payment, and a faded note Tom had scribbled on the back of a grocery list the day he installed the last cedar plank on the porch. He had written that the house felt finished and that our work had been worth it. The note was not notarized. It was worth nothing and everything. I made copies of what a bureaucrat would recognize and set aside what only a wife would keep. On the way out, I asked the clerk to confirm the list of people authorized on my box. He read the names aloud and there were no surprises. He assured me that any change would require my presence. He said the system was secure and smiled the way people do when they are certain their world is punctual and obedient. Systems are only as safe as the people who operate them. I thanked him and went home. Back at the library the next morning, Marla showed me how to open a case on the genealogy site. She suggested I attach scans of the certificates. She said turnaround times varied. I asked if the platform flagged contradictory entries when two sources disagreed. She said the system leaned toward the account holder's edits, unless proven wrong with official documents, and even then, families could create multiple parallel trees showing different versions of reality. She added that the site's philosophy was to let relatives settle disputes themselves. It felt like being told to referee my own erasure. Before I left, I asked Marla to print the page that listed the curator's contact email. It wasn't Diane's personal address. It was a professional account linked to her law firm. The domain looked expensive and permanent. She had moved our family's story under the banner of her career. That was the point. It would be a resume entry, an exhibit of stewardship. While I became the helpful footnote who babysat at home again, I opened the album from the living room cabinet. The plastic sleeves crackled. Several spaces were empty rectangles of pale carpet, where photos had once sat. At first I thought the missing pictures were scattered through other albums. Then I saw the pattern. The absent images were the ones where I stood in the center, the Thanksgiving where I held the carving knife, the summer by the lake where Tom poured lemonade, while I laughed at something the children had done, the school award ceremony where I wore a blue dress and held Emily's flowers. Those were gone. The photos that remained were tidy portraits, children alone, Tom shaking hands with a guest, Diane cutting cake at her graduation, history without the person who cooked, cleaned, taught, and aged beside it. I did not break down. I wrote names and dates on the backs of the photos that remained and slid them into sleeves the way a teacher returns graded papers to a folder. I then created a list on plain notebook paper, documents gathered, calls to be made, accounts to be checked, the box number at the bank, the case number from the genealogy site. At the bottom, I added a sentence that would look strange, out of context. I will not sign anything I did not read twice. It was a rule from my classroom posted now on my refrigerator, next to the family tree printout with the faint ring of coffee in the space that should have held my name. Late afternoon brought a text from Diane thanking everyone who attended the celebration and directing them to the online album she had created. She announced a new project called the Lorne Legacy Archive and invited contributions of stories and photographs. I clicked the link. The cover image was Tom on the front porch, with the oak tree swaying behind him. I knew the photo well. I had taken it. My watermark was cropped out. In the evening, as the sun fell behind the maple and the house took on that blue hour quiet, I stood in front of the mirror and said nothing. I adjusted the collar of my sweater. I reheated stew I had made earlier in the week and ate it at the counter, not bothering with the dining table. When I finished, I washed the bowl and set it upside down on the rack. I am not a woman who thrives on speeches, I am a woman who does the next necessary action until the wall that needs moving starts to shift. The next necessary action was dull on purpose. I requested certified copies of birth records from the county clerk. I wrote a letter to the genealogy site with the case number, listing the names of my children, their dates, the hospital where each was born. I asked the librarian to notarize my statement that the documents were true copies. She declined for the library, but she directed me to a notary at the UPS store who stamped the paper with efficient finality. I compiled everything into a folder that was thick enough to hold shape, but thin enough to hide under a stack of magazines if I needed to. That night I slept with the lamp on, not because I was afraid of the dark, but because light made counting easier. I counted what I had: papers, dates, seals, a ring, a memory of cedar under my hands, a printed page with a root drawn at the bottom. I counted what I had lost: a title on a program, a line on a website, several photographs, a mailbox key. I made a list of who had access to what and who believed they did. Lists do not flinch. In the morning I woke to the ping of another email, this one from a donation platform Diane had set up for the archive. She had written that preserving authentic family history was essential for future generations. Authentic is a word that does a lot of lifting without breaking a sweat. She thanked everyone for entrusting her with the task. She announced that the house would soon be reintroduced to the community under a new name, honoring leadership and progress. The message was careful. It never used the word mine or the word mother. It did not need to. Before I closed my laptop, I returned to the printed family tree and pressed my thumb into an ink pad I keep for labeling jam jars. I stamped my thumbprint in the white square that was supposed to carry a mother's name, flesh on paper, ridges and loops, nothing poetic, just a fact. Then I taped the page to the inside of the pantry door. Every time I reached for flour or sugar, I would see it. A reminder, a record, a private oath. By late afternoon, a quiet resolve settled the way lake water settles after a boat passes. I had filed what needed filing. I had anchored what could be anchored. The drama belonged to other people, people who needed rooms to applaud them. My defense would not be loud, it would be accurate. When I stepped onto the porch to bring in the mat after shaking off a day's worth of dust, I saw Richard, across the street, talking to a man in a jacket with a courier's logo on it. They spoke briefly, and the man handed over a small package before getting back into his van. Richard saw me and lifted a hand that could have been a wave or a shield. He tucked the package into his jacket and turned away. The motion was simple, the implication was not. Packages and keys and changed contact numbers, all designed to move information one step farther from the person to whom it belonged. I closed the door and turned the deadbolt, not out of fear, out of habit sharpened into policy. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and sat down at the table beneath the window. The house smelled like cedar when it rained, even when it wasn't raining. And sometimes that scent was the only argument I needed to continue. I added one more line to my list before folding it shut. Tomorrow I will invite Emily to stop by for tea. She would need to see what had already been reshaped in her absence. She would need to decide whether she could stand still while someone else rewrote her mother into a footnote. For now, the printed program from the anniversary lay beneath my new stack of documents, no longer on top. The order mattered. The story would be set straight, one measured action at a time. When I opened the photo album stacked in the cedar chest, I expected to see the same worn sequence of family life: birthdays, graduations, summer trips, Christmas mornings. Instead, I stared into absences, empty sleeves where glossy prints used to rest, faint outlines on the backing paper where photographs had been pulled away. My name is Vera Lorne, 77 years old, and I know the feel of a missing piece. I taught children for 4 decades. I could tell when a page was torn from a book. Here, in the album that should have carried the record of my family, I was the missing page. I lifted what remained. In one picture, Diane at 14 with a new haircut, Tom standing behind her with his hand on her shoulder. The edge of the photo was cropped, sharp and clean, where my figure had once stood. In another, Richard at 12, holding his baseball glove high after winning his first game. I remembered being there, clapping so hard my palms stung. Yet in this version, there was no mother in the stands. I flipped through more, and the pattern was consistent. When I was central, the image was gone or trimmed. When I was peripheral, I had been sliced away. The work was deliberate. This was not a careless shuffle. The photos had been handled, chosen, altered. The ones that survived created a narrative where children grew under Tom's hand alone, where celebrations occurred without me, where the home had existed independent of my presence. I felt my jaw set tight. Erasure is quieter than insult, but it cuts deeper. That afternoon, Emily came to the house. She is my youngest, 45 now, with tired eyes that still carry the softness of a child who once sang in church choirs. She walked in holding a grocery bag with bread and fruit, setting it on the counter with an apologetic smile. One invited her to sit, and when she saw the albums spread across the table, her face drained of color. I asked her if she had given these photographs to Diane. She hesitated, fingers tightening round the edge of her sleeve. Finally, she admitted she had brought boxes of pictures to Diane's office when asked. Diane had promised to digitize them, to preserve them for the archive. Emily said she thought it was harmless, a way to keep family history safe. Then she stopped, as if she had already said too much. I pressed further. Had she noticed what was missing? Emily's voice faltered. She confessed she had not checked closely, but she had suspected Diane was selective. I could hear the weight in her tone, the mixture of guilt and fear. I asked why she hadn't spoken up. She looked down at her hands and said, almost in a whisper, that Diane had leverage. Diane had threatened to challenge her fitness as a parent if she didn't cooperate. If Emily resisted, she might lose custody of her daughter. In that moment, I understood the bind. Emily was not cruel, not like Diane. She was trapped, yet the effect was the same. She had handed over the tools of my erasure. The albums were the evidence of my life as a mother, and they had been used against me. I rose and went to the sideboard where Tom's keepsakes remained. Among them was a framed photograph from our wedding day. It had sat on that table since he passed, untouched. I held it up next to the album. The wedding photo had been altered, too. The frame contained a copy that was cropped to show only Tom standing tall in his suit, the lace of my gown cut away by a neat border. Someone had replaced the original without me noticing. I turned the frame over, opened the back, and confirmed it. The original was gone. Only this revised version remained. Emily covered her mouth with her hand. She whispered that she hadn't known Diane would go that far, but the evidence was in my hands. History had been rewritten in the most personal archive of all, the record of a marriage, the memory of a beginning. I placed the altered photo back on the table and said nothing for a long time. Silence can be heavier than words. I wanted Emily to feel the weight of it, not as punishment but as recognition of what had been done. She began to cry softly, not the loud tears of absolution, but the quiet ones of someone who understands complicity. I did not comfort her. I did not reach out. I let the moment stand. Then I excused myself and went to the bedroom, where Tom's cedar chest still waited. I opened it again, sifting through old letters, his watch, the report cards of each child. These things were intact. For now, I placed them in a separate box and locked it. If Diane wanted to strip me from history, she would not get these. When I returned, Emily had composed herself. She said she wanted to help, that she would talk to Diane, that she could explain it away as a misunderstanding. I told her no, misunderstanding was not the word for this. This was architecture, a structure of omission built brick by brick. I told her that the truth did not need defense from whispers. It needed defense from facts. Later that evening, after Emily left, I sorted through the albums once more. I made a list of every missing photo, every alteration I recognized, the occasion where I had been cut away. Thanksgiving 1983, 4th of July 1976, Diane's college graduation, Richard's wedding rehearsal. Each absence was a record of a presence denied. The list grew longer than I expected. By the end of it, I had 24 entries. I folded the paper and slipped it into the folder with the birth certificates and marriage license. The folder was thicker now, heavier, a counterweight to the narrative. Diane was writing. That night I could not sleep. I walked the hallway, stopping in front of the pictures still hanging on the walls. Some were untouched. A few, I realized, were replacements. The subtlety made it worse. Diane had chosen carefully which memories to preserve and which to erase, as if curating an exhibit for strangers. I stood before the mirror in the hall and studied my reflection. Lines etched deep, hair white at the roots. This face had lived those moments, raised those children, built that house. It could not be cropped from reality. Yet in the curated version Diane had built, it already was. I thought of Tom's voice. He used to say, "If someone cuts you out of the picture, draw yourself back in." He meant it figuratively, but tonight I took it literally. I pulled out a pen and began sketching myself back into the margins of the photocopied family tree. A crude outline, a claim made visible. Not art, not forgiveness, simply fact. The next morning, I placed the altered wedding photo beside my coffee cup. I stared at Tom's face, alone in the frame. He looked incomplete without me. I whispered, not to him but to the silence of the house, that I was not finished yet. The evidence might have been stripped, but the truth still lived in my memory, and I would not let that be erased. What Diane had done to the photographs was not nostalgia, it was preparation. She was laying the groundwork for a version of history where I did not exist. Emily's trembling confession confirmed it, and I understood then that this was not about pictures. It was about inheritance, about who carried the right to claim the past and therefore the future. I closed the album, set it on the shelf, and began preparing my response. Not with speeches, with records, with lists, with copies that could not be so easily cut away. I would build my own archive, one that could stand against hers, because if Diane wanted to erase her mother, she would have to contend with a woman who knew how to grade, how to document, how to mark every absence until it became undeniable. And as I sat at the table drafting that list, the air of the house, pressed close, heavy with the cedar Tom once hammered into place. The house remembered me. That was enough to begin. I set 2 cups on the kitchen table and waited for the kettle to sing. The album from the cedar chest lay open between the saucers, its empty sleeves glaring in the morning light. My name is Vera Lorne, 77 years old, retired school teacher, and by the time the water boiled I had arranged what remained of my family's photographs into a neat sequence of absences. The chair across from me belonged to Emily. That day she arrived on time, carrying a paper bag with lemons and a loaf of bread, the sort of offering a daughter brings when she wants to soften whatever is about to be said. She saw the album first, not the tea. Her face tightened the way faces do when the truth is waiting on the table. I slid the book toward her. She turned pages slowly, and when she reached the wedding photo cropped, to leave only Tom in the frame, she set both hands flat so the plastic sheet wouldn't tremble. She didn't try to deny it. She didn't excuse it. She only said she had delivered boxes of pictures to Diane's office because she was told the images would be digitized for a family archive. She added that she hadn't looked closely when she picked them up again. Her voice carried the dull certainty of a person who realizes she has handed over the keys without asking what would be locked. I poured tea, and we sat with steam clouding the space between us. Emily glanced at her phone twice and then set it face down. She admitted that Diane had a meeting scheduled later that morning. Something about consolidating paperwork to make household decisions easier. She said it would be quick, routine, nothing to worry about. The words sounded practiced, like lines repeated until they felt safe. I asked her to look at the album again, the trimmed edges, the missing events, the careful removal of the mother who had stood in those rooms. She did not argue. She only folded the napkin in her lap and said Diane had promised that formalizing things now would prevent confusion later. When people ask for permission to tidy history, they always call it clarity. I decided to drive into town when Emily left. The law office occupied the 2nd floor of a red brick building on the square, its windows polished into mirrors that caught the courthouse and the flag. I had been inside before, years back, to notarize a signature for the school district. Today the lobby held fresh flowers and a framed mission statement about stewardship and trust. Diane's name was etched on the glass panel beside the door to the conference room. Each letter crisp and permanent. Emily was already seated when I stepped in. A white folder waited at her elbow, thick with forms. Diane stood near the head of the table, sleeves pushed to the right length, the calm of someone who prefers control to conversation. She acknowledged me as if I were an observer at a civic meeting. The office manager, no name offered, set out a pen with a rubber grip and placed a brass notary stamp on a pad like a small altar. Michael leaned against the credenza, scrolling, his phone, jacket open, shoes spotless, the practiced ease of a 30-year-old who knows cameras will be present wherever he goes. He glanced up long enough to lock eyes with me. The expression conveyed impatience, not curiosity. Diane began, with an explanation that could have come from a brochure. She said, families benefit from a single point of contact for property matters, online accounts, and memorial projects. She referred to the Lorne Legacy Archive as if it were a civic institution and not a page she controlled. She said Emily's signatures would streamline updates and prevent delays for contractors and vendors. The words were coated in efficiency. There was no mention of mothers or memory. The first document looked harmless, a consent to share photos and documents for publication. The second spoke of administrative access to utility accounts. The third contained language I recognized from years of reading permission slips and annual forms. The title used the term authorization. Halfway down the page, the phrase durable powers appeared with the calm certainty of print that knows how to hide in plain sight. The authorization named Diane as agent to act regarding real property, bank communications, and heritage assets, a phrase so new it required quotation marks once and then never again. The sections granting authority were pre-checked and tidy, buffed as the limits were blank. Emily kept her eyes on the spaces where her name should go. She initialed in the right corners, careful and small. The notary stamp came down with a soft click. Michael said something about central dashboards and clean handoffs, mostly to the heir, punctuating his point by taking a photo of the table as if the moment were content. Diane nodded approvingly, the way committees nod when a vote goes as planned. She did not look at me. She didn't need to. Everything that mattered was happening on paper. I watched Emily's hand hover above the last page. I saw the quick swallow, the brief hesitation, the tiny shake of the head almost too small to register. Then the pen moved. After the final signature, she exhaled and reached for her purse. The office manager slid copies into a manila envelope and labeled it with a black marker. Michael asked if she wanted the PDF emailed or uploaded to the archive. Diane answered for her, choosing both. I stood at the corner of the room and looked down at the table. The brass stamp had left a faint circle in the leather pad beneath it. Stamps always leave impressions, even where they aren't pressed. Memorized the notary's commission number, the date, the time, the initials in blue ink at the bottom right of each page. A teacher's habits do not die. I have graded enough papers to know where people hide mistakes and where they display confidence. On the way out, Emily surprised me with a brief touch to my sleeve. It was quick, practiced to escape notice. My bag felt slightly heavier as I stepped into the hall. Michael passed by me with a smug nod, already on his phone telling someone that things were finally streamlined. He used the word legacy as if it were a trademark. When we reached the sidewalk, Diane paused at the curb to greet a couple from church. She offered them a polished summary of how well the archive was progressing. She introduced Emily as the family liaison. She introduced me as our most devoted helper. The couple smiled in that careful way people do when politeness is a duty. I stood beside them and let the word helper ride the air between us. It told me everything I needed to know about where the conversation was headed next. I waited until I reached my car to check my bag. Inside, tucked in the pocket where I keep extra tissues, lay a small square of stationery folded twice. Emily's handwriting is unmistakable, tidy, slightly right-leaning, the work of someone who spent years filling out forms for school and doctor's offices. I did not read it in the car. I drove home first. The house greeted me with the smell of dry wood and old coffee grounds. I set the bag on the table, washed my hands, and only then unfolded the note. She wrote that she had signed because she was told her role as a mother would be examined in court if she refused. She wrote that Diane had threatened to file motions that would drain her savings and smear her as unstable. She wrote that, for now, she would appear to cooperate so that she could see what else was being arranged behind closed doors. She wrote that she would collect what she could, emails, drafts, lists Diane kept on her computer. She wrote that she had not chosen Diane over me. She chose survival. She asked me to trust that this was not the end of the story. I placed the note under Tom's paperweight, a small brass oak leaf he used to keep receipts in place when the porch door let the breeze in. Sentimentality was not the point. Paper needs a weight to keep from sliding off the truth. The rest of the afternoon I spent doing what I know best, recording. I wrote the date, the address of the office, the notary's commission number, the witness initials, the exact titles printed on each form. I called the county clerk's office to ask how changes to property records are typically filed and how soon they appear in the system. I did not accuse anyone of anything. I asked about timelines and procedures. The woman on the phone listed steps while I took notes in a column with square boxes I could check. She mentioned document numbers, reception, stamps, and scanning queues. At the end, she suggested I set up alerts for my parcel. I thanked her and did exactly that. Evening came early, as it often does in months when the sun loses interest by late afternoon. I walked the perimeter of the house the way Tom used to, checking the gutters, the porch rail, the lock on the shed. Routine is a kind of map. In the shed I found the box of nails Tom kept labeled with his blocky handwriting. A note inside read porch, last run. I held it a moment and put it back. Small things like that keep a person anchored. Before bed, I laid out what would matter in the days ahead. Marriage certificate, birth certificates, photocopies, and certified copies in separate folders. My own list of events written in a steady hand that would not be mistaken for confusion. I added Emily's note to a third folder I labeled in pencil so I could erase and rename it later. Pencil has its own wisdom. In the morning, I received a notification from the genealogy platform. Diane had posted a cheerful update thanking contributors for new images and promising to unveil a rebranded homepage for the archive. The banner photo was Tom on the porch with the oak tree shading him. My watermark was gone there too. She described the project as a way to ensure accuracy across generations. Accuracy, in that context, meant alignment with her version. I took a screenshot and printed it. Screens shift. Paper resists. I drove to the UPS store that afternoon, not because I needed to ship anything, but because the notary there recognizes me now. She stamped my one-page statement summarizing what I had observed at the office, the date and time, the names present, the documents I could identify by title. The statement didn't accuse, it recorded. She asked, with her professional kindness, if everything was all right. I answered that I was organizing. Organizing is a harmless word for building a defense. On the way home, I stopped at the cemetery to straighten Tom's flag. Leaves had gathered at the base of the stone. I cleared them with my shoe. I told him nothing and everything, by the way. I pressed the soil firm around the holder. When I turned back toward the road, I passed the courthouse and saw Michael cross the square with a box under his arm. He carried it as if it contained something vital and fragile, the way people carry trophies and electronics. He saw me and lifted the corner of the box in a brief salute. I did not return the gesture. I watched him enter the law office building and disappear into the elevator's mirrored mouth, back at the house. I noticed a faint scrape on the doorframe near the lock. Not fresh, not old, just there. I added a drop of oil to the hinge. Small maintenance tells a simple story. Someone still lives here who cares how things work. In the late afternoon, Emily texted that she had sent me an email from a new account. I opened it on the desktop because I didn't want Diane's systems to catch the forwarding trail on a shared thread. Emily had attached photographs of the forms she could access from the office server when the receptionist stepped away. She had captured headers and footers, letterheads and timestamps, enough to show that the documents went beyond convenience. One page outlined procedures for making decisions on behalf of declining relatives to avoid conflict. Another listed steps for transferring utility accounts and property notices into a single login controlled by a designated manager. Emily's note in the email was short and careful. She said she would continue to send pieces when she could. She asked me not to reply. She reminded me to keep physical copies and to date everything I printed. She was precise in a way that sounded like a promise kept under strain. I printed the attachments, filed them by the titles at the bottom, and wrote the date in the margin. Then I made a quiet change of my own. I moved the cedar chest from the bedroom to the hall closet, cleared a low shelf, and placed it behind a stack of winter blankets. I tucked the deed, the certificates, and Emily's note into a fireproof pouch and slid it under the chest. I set the photo album back inside the chest, closed the lid, and draped an old quilt over the top. Anyone searching would find the album first and believe the obvious thing had been hidden. The important things would be lower than the eye expects. Years of teaching had taught me to think like the person taking the test and the person writing it by nightfall. The house felt steady. Again, the oak outside shifted in a light wind, leaves tapping the window like polite visitors. I made a pot of soup and ate standing at the counter. The day had been a ledger of actions. Attend, observe, record, file, secure. Somewhere in a downtown office, copies of Emily's signatures were already being archived under a heading that suggested order. In my kitchen, the counter held a different order, one I could trust because I had built it myself. Page by page. Before sleep, I returned to the pantry door where I had taped the printed family tree with my inked thumbprint in the square meant to hold a mother's name. I pressed my thumb there again. Darker this time. Not rage, not plea. Just a mark that said a person stands here who will not disappear because someone else prefers a cleaner frame. Emily's note under the brass leaf held its corner firmly. I slid it out long enough to read the last line again, and then replaced it. The day had asked for endurance, not eloquence. Tomorrow would ask for the same. I turned off the kitchen light and felt my way down the hall. The house settled around me with the familiar creaks of wood, remembering who built it. The sign went up on a Monday morning. I saw it from the road before I reached the drive. A glossy white board staked into the grass, where Tom once hammered in a birdhouse for the grandchildren. It read Diane's Lodge in bold blue lettering, with a tidy logo of a pinnacone beneath. The words looked like a brand, not a home. My name, my husband's name. The years of sweat and wages that raised those beams and laid those floorboards, none of it appeared. Two strangers driving past, the place looked like a business, detached from history, waiting for customers rather than family. My name is Vera Lorne, 77 years old, once a schoolteacher, always Tom's wife, and until now the steward of this cedar-framed house. Standing at the mailbox that morning, I felt as if the ground had shifted, as though the porch I had scrubbed 1,000 times belonged to another woman, whose story had been rewritten while she slept. Inside, I found more evidence. The framed needlepoint Tom's mother had given Us, the one, stitched with the words, "The Lorne Home, EST, 1967, was gone from the hallway wall. In its place hung a sleek wooden plaque, laser engraved with "Welcome to Diane's Lodge." The edges gleamed. I touched it with my finger, expecting it to feel foreign, and it did. I checked the other rooms, where once my grandchildren's handprints had been pressed in plaster. There was now drywall patched smooth, painted over as if their palms had never touched that wall. When I opened the laptop, the browser auto-loaded a page advertising luxury countryside stays at Diane's Lodge. There were photos of my kitchen counters cleared of the canisters I had owned for decades. My bedroom stripped of the quilt I stitched with Tom, replaced by a neutral spread. Each caption described modern rustic comfort, as if those walls had been built by architects, not a couple saving paychecks over 40 years. At the bottom of the listing, the words leaped out: former family property, now under new stewardship, available for nightly rental. I felt as if I had been declared dead while still standing in my slippers. I scrolled further and found the most cutting part. One of the guest rooms was listed as the Granny Suite, offered at a premium rate because of its authentic charm. The photographs were unmistakable. They showed my own bedroom. My vanity table was gone, my cedar chest pushed out of sight, my curtains replaced. Only the outline in the wood where Tom's chair once sat betrayed that anyone had ever lived here, and the description said, "Ideal for guests seeking the warmth of a bygone era, with none of the clutter of the past." My life reduced to clutter. I walked through the rooms like a visitor myself. The scent of polish had replaced the smell of soap and cedar. It was clear now. Diane had not merely decided to rename the property. She had staged it for outsiders, scrubbed me from its story, and prepared to profit. She had taken my bed, my dresser, the space where I folded laundry, and where Tom read the newspaper each morning, and turned it into a commodity. And she had done it all under the banner of legacy. Later that afternoon, I drove into town to confront her. Her office lobby smelled of lemon cleaner. Her secretary offered me a smile to practice, and when Diane finally emerged, she wore a blazer the color of slate and an expression that did not shift. She did not invite me in. Instead, she asked if I had come about the transition. Transition? She used the word the way hospital pamphlets use it, for dying patients. She said the rebranding would secure the house's future value, make it easier to market, and protect the family from financial decline. She said I should be proud that my home would now welcome travelers, corporate retreats, and long-term clients. I told her it was not a lodge. It was a house built by calloused hands, paid for with overtime shifts and careful savings, held together with the sound of laughter and argument and forgiveness. She did not blink. She said sentimentality had its place, but stewardship required decisions that might seem harsh. She said Emily had already signed the necessary consents. She said Richard's silence meant tacit approval, and she said Michael was handling the online marketing. So there was no point in resisting. I left without arguing further because I recognized something old in her voice. It was the same tone she had used as a girl when she wanted to win at debate. Clop, when she would press the final point and leave no room for dissent. But this was not debate. This was erasure. That evening, I discovered another layer. The property tax website had been updated. The mailing address for notices now listed Diane's office, and the occupancy record, which had once identified owner, occupied, had been changed to Nona. In legal language, that meant something more permanent than a sign or a plaque. It meant that in the eyes of county records, I no longer lived here, even as I sat at my own kitchen table. The next morning, I heard voices outside. Through the curtains, I saw Michael standing on the porch with a young couple pulling rolling suitcases. He handed them a key code, gestured toward the entryway, and described the amenities. I opened the door before they could cross the threshold. I asked Michael what he thought he was doing. He looked at me as though I were the intruder. He said the bookings had already been confirmed, that guests were entitled to their stay, and that I could remain in the caretaker's quarters if I wished. Caretaker. Another word chosen to strip me of claim. The couple looked uneasy, glancing between us, uncertain who belonged here. Michael reassured them that I was just family helping out. They wheeled their bags past me without another word, disappearing into the hallway I had swept for 50 years. After they closed the door to what had been my bedroom, I felt something harden in me. Not grief this time, not confusion, but resolve. I knew enough from my years of teaching to recognize when a story was being rewritten in front of children. And I knew enough now to see the same was happening to me. They wanted me reduced to a role, renamed, moved aside. But I also knew how to keep records, how to preserve truth, and how to teach lessons that could not be erased. I made a call to the assessor's office, asking how occupancy status could be changed without an owner's signed affidavit. The clerk sounded surprised. She said a notarized statement was required, with supporting documentation. She said the update must have been based on paperwork recently filed. She promised to send copies. That night, alone in the kitchen while strangers slept in my bed, I unfolded Emily's earlier note again. Her warning about threats, about legal intimidation, about playing along to survive it, all made sense now. Diane had created the appearance of consent, stacked signatures into the file, and built a paper trail strong enough to convince a county office, and she had used Michael's photographs to stage the proof. I looked around at the house, at the walls stripped of memory, at the sign outside declaring it something it had never been. I thought of Tom's hands, the calluses, the way he measured each beam twice before cutting once. I thought of my own hands, worn from chalk dust and dishwater, steady when they stitched quilts late into the night. I realized then that they had not simply taken photographs or names. They were taking the frame itself, the house, the record, the foundation, and redrawing it without me. But a teacher learns the value of evidence. A teacher knows that what is written, what is dated, what is recorded cannot be easily denied. So I sharpened a pencil, opened a notebook, and began to write the timeline in my own hand. The day the sign appeared, the morning the listing went live, the afternoon I saw Michael deliver guests into my home, each line a proof, each date a nail in the structure of truth. When I finished, I looked up at the ceiling beams Tom had set himself. They had held for 50 years. They would hold for me now, and if Diane thought a sign could erase me, she was about to learn that a name written in love, in sweat, in years, cannot be painted over. I had not planned to speak to Pastor Samuel that Sunday. I only went to the church because the silence in the house had grown unbearable, broken only by the footsteps of strangers dragging their luggage across my floors. The sanctuary smelled the same as always, Polish on the pews, dust clinging to hymnals, but I felt like an intruder even there, as if the steady faces of neighbors carried knowledge I did not yet have. After service, Pastor Samuel, a man of 60, with kind but cautious eyes, greeted me at the door. He had baptized my children, presided over Tom's funeral, and always carried himself with a measured tone. He asked how I was managing, his voice heavy with the weight of knowing more than he said. I told him I had seen my bedroom advertised as a suite, that Diane's name now stood where mine once had, and that my own children spoke of me as though I were a guest in their lives. His expression shifted, not to shock, but to something like regret. He touched my arm gently, as though deciding whether to continue. then asked if we could speak privately. We sat in his office, the door closed, the blinds half drawn. He told me something I had never known. Years ago, near the end of Tom's illness, Diane had approached him about arranging a temporary guardianship for family finances. He had thought it unusual but not unheard of children stepping in to handle paperwork when a parent was too consumed with care. He said Diane had presented documents that bore my name, notarized, affirming that she had my blessing to sign on my behalf. He admitted now that he had believed her without question, since she was a lawyer and my daughter. I told him I had never signed such papers. Not once. My hand shook on the arm of the chair, but not from weakness. It shook from the recognition that the theft had not begun last month or last year, but while Tom still drew breath, while I was cooking him meals and changing his sheets. Diane was already writing me out of the story. Samuel leaned forward, lowering his voice, almost as if he were confessing. He said the church loan committee had once been approached to guarantee a small note against the house. Diane had assured them it was to cover Tom's treatments, that I was aware that it was only a bridge until insurance caught up. The papers bore what looked like my signature. He admitted now that he had doubts, but at the time, no one wanted to question a daughter helping her parents. I left his office feeling as if the air had thickened, like I was wading through something invisible but suffocating. The betrayal was not new. It was years old, layered into the foundation of my days without my knowledge. Diane had not just struck in the open with her plaques and listings. She had been chiseling away in secret, forging my hand, reshaping the record long before I ever noticed. Back at the house, I searched through Tom's old file cabinet in the den. The drawers stiff with age, I pulled out folders of tax returns, receipts, and hospital bills. In between, I found statements I did not recognize, loan agreements with my name on them, dated during the worst of Tom's decline. The handwriting in the signature block was close enough to pass to a casual eye, but I knew the difference. A wife knows the rhythm of her own hand. Mine curved. This one pressed straight. Mine looped. This one cut sharp. It was Diane's. I sat on the floor among the papers, the edges biting into my palms, and I remembered Tom coughing in the next room, calling softly for water, never knowing that, while he suffered, our daughter was turning his struggle into her leverage. That evening, I called Diane. I asked her directly about the papers, about the loans, about the lies told in my name. Her tone did not falter. She said she had done what was necessary to protect assets when I was too distracted by grief. She said I should thank her for keeping the roof over my head all these years, since without her foresight we might have lost it already. Said the documents were valid, notarized, filed, and no one would believe otherwise. For a moment I could not breathe. Then I found words I did not know I still possessed. I told her Tom would have been ashamed, that he would have rather lived in debt than see our children reduce his wife to a footnote. She laughed not with mirth but with dismissal. She said sentiment was not currency, and history was written by those who acted, not those who wept. Then she ended the call. I sat in the dark, phone still in my hand, until I realized my tears had dried. In their place came a sharp clarity. I had taught children for decades, watched them try to pass off copied homework, forged notes from parents, excuses too polished to be genuine. I had always known how to spot the false from the true, and I knew now what Diane had done. She had not only altered today, she had rewritten yesterday. The next morning, I visited the courthouse. I asked for copies of every filing related to my property in the last 10 years. The clerk gave me a heavy folder, its weight both terrifying and affirming. Inside, I saw line after line of my forged name. Transfers, authorizations, liaisons, presented as if I had consented. And at the bottom of each, the neat stamp of approval from offices that never questioned. I carried that folder back home like a weapon, each page a strike waiting to be delivered. Diane thought she had buried the past, but in truth, she had left fingerprints everywhere. And I knew this much. Truth has patience. It waits beneath the surface until the right hand uncovers it. As night fell, I lit the lamp in the den and spread the papers across Tom's old desk. The weight of his absence pressed down, but so did the memory of his stubbornness, his refusal to let go of what was rightfully his. I whispered aloud to him, as if he could hear. They thought they could erase me, but I will not vanish quietly. And for the first time since this battle began, I felt not despair, but a grim kind of strength. Diane had built her story on signatures that were not mine. I would build mine on the truth she had tried to bury, and I would make sure, when the time came, that everyone would see it. The letter arrived, folded into thirds, stamped with the county seal, and a date that left no time to stall. It announced a hearing to determine whether management of my property and affairs should be reassigned for efficiency and protection. No mention of age, no insult printed in ink, just a sentence built to look neutral while it pointed me toward the door of my own life. I am Vera Lorne, 77, a retired schoolteacher who can still read between the lines. The notice listed exhibits already submitted by the petitioner, my eldest, and the time and place, the small courtroom, off the main corridor of the courthouse where townspeople usually pay traffic fines. I prepared in the way I know. I packed a folder with certified copies of my marriage certificate, the deed, the final mortgage receipt, and the list I have kept since the day the sign went into my yard. I numbered each page in pencil. I placed a blank notepad on top. It steadies me to watch ink meet paper in rows that don't lie. I wore the same navy dress I wore to Tom's retirement dinner because it fits without fuss and because I once stood straight in it while people acknowledged work honestly done. Outside the courtroom door, I recognized the players. Diane stood with the binder pressed to her ribs, a lawyer who had the convenience of being both counsel and daughter. Michael leaned against the wall, balancing a tablet on his palm, ready to show screens as if they were windows. Richard kept distance, eyes on the floor, hands stuffed too deep into his jacket pockets. Emily stood a half step behind, avoiding everyone's gaze, her face set in that pale concentration of someone who knows she has stepped onto ice and cannot move backward or forward without cracking something open. The clerk called the case. We filed into a room that pretends to be grand with its wood paneling and flags, but is really just another office where decisions are made by people reading paper. The magistrate listened to Diane outline her petition. She spoke calmly about streamlining and consolidating, about the need to resolve confusion in property records and utility accounts, about coordinating heritage assets for the archive. She described me as beloved but disorganized, a woman who had become forgetful with time, who sometimes repeated stories and mislaid keys, who might be signing forms she did not fully understand. She never used the word incapable. She did not need to. Michael took the stand first. He presented photographs of my house from the listing page, the shots that show rooms clean of history. He swiped through calendar screenshots to display bookings and payments, arguing that guest schedules conflicted with an owner's residence, and that recent occupancy records proved his point. He explained that he had installed a keyless entry system and that there had been confusion because the homeowner sometimes changed the code on a whim. He described me as sweet and old-fashioned, someone who sometimes told guests they were in the wrong room. He smiled like a tour guide who had learned to make apologies sound charming. Next, Diane submitted printouts from the genealogy site. She called it the definitive record our family had agreed to use. The tree showed Tom, the children, and a mother's box that did not bear my name. She called this historical corroboration, as if code and crops could outrank birth certificates. She included the program from the anniversary with the small italics that called me caregiver. She added the property tax entry showing the changed occupancy status. She supplied the organizational chart for the Lorne Legacy Archive listing herself as director, Emily as liaison, Michael as media lead, and me as volunteer. The magistrate asked procedural questions. He wanted to know if any evaluations had been done. Diane said no doctor's notes were needed for the request at hand. She was not asking to control my person, only to manage my property and related communications. She framed it as a courtesy. To me, she said she feared scams and opportunists might target a woman living alone. She described the Airbnb program as an interim revenue plan to cover taxes and maintenance once the house's name aligned with public interest. Then the clerk called a name that pulled me back to daylight. Neighbor Linda stepped forward from the benches. This was her first appearance in this war, and she was introduced formally as Linda Perkins, 65, retired postal sorter, who lives across from me and has, by training and habit, a precise memory for who comes and goes. She is not warm by default and not cruel either. She operates with the accuracy of someone who understands that mail reaches the wrong hands when attention wavers. Linda explained that she had watched crews arrive to switch out the sign. She had seen furniture carried out and new furniture carried in. She had observed guests arriving with luggage, and a young man in a jacket Michael delivering coded instructions. She stated that I continued to collect my mail daily, and that I water my porch plants, that I sweep the steps and bring in the bins. She noted that she had received a flyer addressed Resident Advertising, Diane's Lodge, and offering a discount code for locals booking family events. Her tone did not attempt to help me or them. She reported, "That is what I needed." Diane thanked Linda for her community-minded vigilance and used the testimony to reinforce the idea that the property was changing use and therefore required professional oversight. She called the sign and the bookings evidence of active stewardship. Linda did not look at me or at Diane when she stepped down. She returned to the bench with the small satisfaction of a task correctly done. When it was my turn, I did not deliver speeches. I set my folder on the table and handed the magistrate the certified copies, the deeds, the mortgage receipt stamped, paid. I kept my voice steady. I described the pattern of removal from our family records, the cropping of photographs, the change of occupancy status that I had not requested, the new mailing address for tax notices that did not belong to me. I explained the online listings that turned my bedroom into a suite. I summarized the sequence with dates and times, not adjectives. I placed my list on the record. The magistrate paged through with his finger following the numbers. He nodded at the dates, in a way that told me the habit of order still carries weight in some rooms. Diane countered, with a form I had not yet seen, an affidavit signed under the letterhead of her office stating that I had authorized administrative handling of non-personal household matters. The signature used my name in a hand that nodded toward mine without reaching it. The notary stamp was local. The date placed it in the thick of Tom's illness. I recognized the technique at once. She had sketched my script by memory and captured it on a day when I would have been at the hospital or asleep in a chair. The magistrate checked the stamp number with the clerk, who read it back from the registries. The seal was genuine, even if the hand was not. He then asked if anyone could speak to my ability to handle mail, bills, and basic record keeping. Diane gestured toward Richard. He took the stand reluctantly, shuffling, offering the measured vagueness of a man trying to avoid perjury without betraying his sister. He mentioned that I sometimes misplaced notices. He added that I had asked him to check on a bank letter recently. He left out that the letter was addressed to me, at his address. He left out the missing spare mailbox key. He confirmed that life had become complicated since Tom died. He did not look at me when he stepped down. Emily was called next. She confirmed that she had signed documents at Diane's office to streamline family matters. She stated that she believed it would help avoid confusion. She did not volunteer anything more. Her mouth pressed into a flat line only I recognized as grief's quiet cousin. When the magistrate asked if she had observed me appearing lost, she chose her words carefully. She said grief can make anyone misplace things. She said that I keep lists and check them. She said I had taught her that a list is a promise to yourself. The magistrate nodded again, but this time his eyes went to Diane's binder, not my folder. The legal burden was not what the movies teach. No gavel crash, no grand confession, just forms, stamps, and a magistrate balancing paperweight in his hands. He announced that, pending a status review, he would allow a limited management order authorizing Diane to act on property-related communications and bookings, with the expectation that she would keep transparent records. He used the word temporary. He set a follow-up date. He said nothing about my capacity as a person. He framed the decision as a precaution, not a judgment. I heard the decision the way a retired teacher hears the final bell, not as an ending, but as a signal to move to the next task. The limited order was a blow, but it was not the final measure. It gave Diane momentum and legitimacy. It also required her to file what she had been hiding. Paper must now meet public ink. That will be her mistake. After the hearing, in the corridor, Diane gathered her team like a coach handing out assignments. Michael would push new messages about the lodge to fill the calendar. Richard would monitor deliveries and utilities. Emily's job title remained liaison. None of this was said aloud in my earshot. I watched their faces and knew the roles by the way they touched their phones and straightened their jackets. I am not a stranger to choreography. The dance of committees is the same in schools and courts. Linda paused near the stairwell. She met my eyes just long enough to do something practical. She scribbled her phone number on the back of a grocery list and handed it to me, folded once. She said she is home most afternoons and sees who stops by. She added that if official envelopes show up addressed to anyone but me, she will note the time and the carrier and let me know. No pity, no flourish, just method. That small square of paper felt like a hinge-turning dot. At home, a couriered packet waited on the porch, addressed to resident with a sticker carrying the lodge's logo. Inside, I found a brand guide for Diane's project, a list of preferred terms for advertising, and a schedule for staged photography. The guide instructed staff never to use the word mother in captions. Family was to be referred to as founders. The main bedroom would be labeled Heritage Suite. Volunteers were to be called keepers, not relatives. Words arranged to do the work of a chisel. I sat at Tom's desk and set the new packet beside the certified documents. I drew a single line on my notepad down the center of a page and made 2 columns. On the left, I listed their labels: caregiver, helper, volunteer, lodge, founder, temporary management. On the right, I wrote the facts: mother, owner, home, wife, paid mortgage in full, deed recorded. I underlined the right-hand column once. My hands did not shake. That evening, I walked the boundary of the house. The oak brushed the roofline with a sound that has meant safety for decades. The porch boards held under my steps. I came inside and placed Tom's ring on top of the limited order, then covered both with the final mortgage receipt. A simple stack, a small altar to reality. I know how to teach children to check their work. I will teach a courtroom the same way, one clear example after another, until error becomes undeniable. Before I slept, I taped a fresh page to the pantry door next to the family tree. In a teacher's block letters, I wrote the sentence I intend to carry into every room from now on. The person who built this home is still here. I pressed my thumb to the ink pad and left a print below the sentence. Not ceremony. Evidence. Morning would bring the mail and likely another change I had not permitted. Morning would bring neighbors asking careful questions and guests wheeling suitcases across my floors. Morning would bring the reality that a limited order can be stretched by those who benefit from loopholes. But morning would also bring light. Light reveals edges. Edges reveal seams. Seams reveal where something has been stitched to look like it belongs. I have spent my life checking seams. Now I will pull at them until the false piece comes free. The first signal came from a slip of paper folded into the grocery circular on my porch. Inside was not a coupon but a receipt. A wire transfer acknowledgement for $10,000 routed from an account in Diane's office trust fund to one bearing Michael's name. The date was just a week before the hearing. Someone wanted me to see it, though no sender was noted. I held it long enough to feel the edges dampen with my hand. Then I tucked it into my folder. Numbers rarely lie when printed by banks. That evening Michael came by under the pretense of checking locks for safety. He wore his lawyer's grin, even without the license. "Grandma, you shouldn't stress yourself. Diane's taking care of everything. You'll be comfortable." His comfort did not include me living in my house. He spoke like a man who had already moved me to a facility. I asked him directly why his name appeared on financial transfers tied to the archive. He blinked once, then deflected. "That's just administrative, to help with digital services. You wouldn't understand." His tone carried the arrogance of someone paid to hold a position, not earn it. Later, Emily arrived unannounced. She looked thinner, eyes sunken, her hands restless. On the back of the kitchen chair, she whispered that Michael had been promising Diane full cooperation in exchange for tuition money for his next degree and a down payment on a downtown condo. She confessed she had overheard Diane tell him, "Once mother is declared incompetent, everything we do is airtight." Emily wept as she said it. I placed my hand over hers but did not speak comfort. I needed her words as testimony, not tears. The following day, flyers appeared across town, advertising the lodge at Lorne. The design carried polished images of the house stripped of its history, rooms staged with generic furniture. At the bottom, it listed founding partners, Diane Lorne and Michael Lorne. My name was absent. To the public, grandmother had become obsolete, erased, irrelevant. I walked to the market and saw one pinned on the notice board above used car ads. Strangers studied it as if the house had always been theirs to rent. I went to the courthouse records office and requested property files. The clerk hesitated, explaining that Diane had already placed digital copies on file. My access was restricted pending authorization. I pressed my palm on the counter, steady as chalk on a blackboard. and reminded him that the deed bore my signature and mortgage stamp. After some resistance, he fetched the hard folder. Inside, stapled to my documents, was a new addendum designating Michael as junior custodian under Diane's supervision. The date of filing was the same day as the transfer receipt. When I returned home, a car idled in my driveway. Linda leaned against the hood with her arms crossed. She had been watching deliveries again. She reported that Michael had been dropping off branded boxes to the porch for photography, all marked with the lodge logo. She added that she had seen him late at night walking through the rooms with a camera, staging shots as if I were a relic, not a resident. Linda said simply, "He's being groomed." Her voice carried no affection. She handed me another envelope, this one left at her door by mistake containing a contract draft that described me as former resident. That night, I laid every piece of evidence across Tom's old desk: the receipt, the contract, the flyers, the record addendum. The pattern was no longer theory. Diane had installed Michael as her heir apparent in the project of erasure. She was writing me out not only of the past but of the present. The next morning, I called a meeting at the church hall, under the guise of inviting the family to discuss holiday arrangements. Everyone came. Diane walked in briskly with her binder. Michael arrived with his tablet, already prepared to display slides. Richard slouched behind, silent, tired of battles he would never win. Emily followed last, pale, her lips pressed tight. I opened the meeting by placing the wire transfer receipt on the table. $10,000, I said evenly. Michael's hand twitched, but he recovered. He claimed it was for software upgrades, routine expenses. I slid the property addendum across the wood. Custodian, I read aloud. He shifted again. Diane cut in, spinning a narrative of efficiency, of generational succession. She spoke as if my words were irrelevant, as if decisions had already been certified. Then, Linda entered, uninvited but not unwelcome. She carried with her the misdelivered contract and placed it in front of me. Diane's eyes widened just enough to betray recognition. I read aloud the line, "Former resident." Gasps rippled even from Richard, who had grown numb. Michael swallowed, his confidence cracking. Emily rose, trembling, and said she had witnessed Diane promise Michael full ownership once I was declared unfit. She did not say it with drama, but with a teacher's cadence. Clear, deliberate. The room chilled. Michael opened his mouth to deny it, but Diane silenced him with a look that held both fury and calculation. I spoke then, not in anger but in the same measured tone I once used to quiet a classroom. "You have tried to erase me from records, from photographs, from memory. Now you appoint successors to property that is not yours. But documents do not erase blood. Records can be falsified, but history breathes through witnesses. And I am still here." Diane snapped her binder shut. Michael muttered that everything was legal. But the room had shifted. Linda's presence, Emily's confession, the evidence on the table, it all pulled the veil from their scheme. Even Richard stared at his sister as though seeing her for the first time without her polished armor. After they left in silence, Emily lingered. She whispered that she would gather proof, emails, records Diane thought deleted. Her fear was still strong, but something had cracked open. I touched her cheek and told her truth has weight. She nodded, tears silent, and slipped away. I locked the documents back in my folder. The battle was not finished, but the board had shifted. Diane had revealed her strategy, not only to strip me of standing but to plant Michael as her successor, cementing erasure across generations. They thought money could buy loyalty, that papers could bury presence. They forgot that I have lived through decades of tests, that I have graded lies disguised as essays, that I can see the margin where truth fails to align. Night settled heavy, but I sat at Tom's desk again, hands steady, and wrote a sentence in ink. "They cannot declare me gone while I breathe in this house." I underlined it once. The oak outside rustled, steady as a witness. I am Vera Lorne. I have been called babysitter, caregiver, volunteer, former resident, but I remain mother, owner, and survivor. And soon, I will be their reckoning. The hall was filled with the usual hum of Sunday gathering, though this was no service. Diane had chosen the church as the stage for what she called the family resolution meeting, bringing her legal drafts and her allies, expecting to close the matter by force of signatures. I arrived with a plain folder and no lawyer. My allies were paper and truth, and the weight of years they could not erase. She stood at the front, Michael beside her, The binders spread like scripture. "We are here to formalize the transition," she announced. "Mother has been struggling, and it's time the family secures stability. This is not about disrespect, but about continuity." The words floated on polished tones, but the undertow was theft. I rose, slow but steady, and placed my folder on the table. "Before we sign away history, let us examine what is being signed." From inside, I pulled a printed email. Emily had delivered it to me that morning, her hands shaking as though she were handing me contraband. The email bore Diane's letterhead, addressed to Emily. It read, "If you don't hand over the photographs, I will use your custody file against you. Cooperate, and you'll keep your daughter. Resist, and you'll lose everything." Gasps stirred. Emily's face was pale, but her chin lifted. "She threatened me," she said, voice breaking but strong enough to carry. "She made me cut Mother out of those pictures. I was not disloyal by choice, I was coerced." Diane slammed her binder shut. "Lies," she hissed. But the crowd shifted. Even Richard leaned forward, studying his sister with unease. I placed the next item on the table, Tom's last letter. I had found it tucked behind a shelf in his desk weeks ago, a sealed envelope, dated in his final months. He wrote, in his firm script, that the house was to remain mine as long as I lived, and upon my passing it would pass equally, without manipulation. He wrote of his fear that Diane's ambition would override family bonds. He asked any who read to honor the truth of his wife's role as builder and keeper. The letter bore his signature and date. Pastor Samuel, standing near the doorway, confirmed the handwriting. "I counseled Tom in those days," he said quietly. "That is his voice. He wanted Vera's role protected." Michael shifted, his confidence fracturing. "This doesn't change," he began, but Linda cut him off. She stepped forward from the back, holding the flyer of the lodge at Lorne. "You marketed this house as yours while she still lived here. You put her name in the past tense. I've lived across from her for 30 years. She is not gone." The hall turned. The weight of witnesses pressed on Diane and Michael like stone. Diane's mouth opened, then closed, the calculation running fast behind her eyes. But she had been cornered. Every avenue of denial was blocked by paper, testimony, and memory she could not delete. I spoke then, not loud but certain. "For months, you tried to erase me. You stripped my name from records, cut me from photographs, turned my house into a showroom. You told others I was no longer here, but I am here. I remain." Diane's shoulders sagged, her polish cracking. She gathered her binder and left the hall without another word, Michael trailing, pale and silent. Richard said nothing, only shaking his head as though dizzy from seeing what ambition had wrought. Emily collapsed into tears beside me, though this time it was relief, not fear. I did not celebrate. I simply placed Tom's letter back into my folder. The matter was closed, not by triumph, but by survival. My name, my place, my house, these were not gifts returned, but rights reasserted. When the hall emptied and quiet returned, I sat alone in the pew. I looked back over what had unfolded since that anniversary. A single introduction. The babysitter had been the stone dropped into water. From it rippled an attempt to erase an entire life. Step by step, I was cut out of memory, record, and even the walls around me. At each turn, I discovered how far those closest would go when blinded by ambition or fear. The lesson is colder than comfort. Blood does not guarantee loyalty. Age does not guarantee respect. Sacrifice does not guarantee gratitude. I learned that you cannot wait for others to defend your place. You must defend it yourself, even when your hands shake. It is not enough to believe love will preserve your name. You must keep evidence, guard memory, and be willing to speak when others hope you are too weary. For women my age, the deepest wound is not insult, it is erasure, to be treated as if your years can be overwritten by those who came after. But I have found that erasure only works when you remain silent. If you speak, if you place truth on the table where everyone can see, silence is broken, and history steadies itself again. To those watching who have felt the sting of dismissal from your own family, do not confuse endurance with invisibility. Protect what is yours not with bitterness, but with clarity. Keep records, hold witnesses, and know that your presence is the anchor. They may scheme around you, but they cannot write you out if you refuse to leave the page. I am Vera Lorne. They called me babysitter, caregiver, former resident. Today, I stand as what I have always been: mother, builder, witness, keeper of memory. To those of you who sit in shadows, wondering if your story still matters, let me tell you it does. And if they try to take it, fight not with rage but with truth. It is sharper than anger and heavier than shame. Thank you for walking with me through this journey. If my voice has reached you, stay with me for the next one. There are more stories to tell and more silences to break.